The conflict between Russia and Ukraine entered its 1,398th day with developments that underscore both the continuing intensity of combat operations and the complex diplomatic maneuvering aimed at finding some pathway toward peace. Though the gap between the two sides remains substantial and the human toll continues to mount with each passing day. The most dramatic development came not from the front lines in Ukraine but from the heart of the Russian capital itself, where Lieutenant General Fanil Sarvarov became the latest victim in what has become a disturbing pattern of targeted assassinations against senior Russian military leadership. The car bomb that killed Sarvarov in southern Moscow represents the third such killing of a high-ranking Russian military officer in just slightly more than a year, revealing either serious vulnerabilities in Russian security protocols or the sophisticated capabilities of whoever is conducting these operations. Russian investigators have pointed their fingers directly at Ukraine, suggesting that Ukrainian special forces or intelligence services orchestrated the attack, though officials in Kyiv have maintained their characteristic silence on the matter, neither confirming nor denying involvement in an assassination that took place hundreds of kilometers from the front lines. The killing of Sarvarov carries particular significance because of his role as head of the Russian Armed Forces Operational Training Directorate, a position that placed him at the center of efforts to train and prepare Russian forces for combat operations in Ukraine. His death represents not just the loss of one individual but the elimination of decades of institutional knowledge and experience that the Russian military can ill afford to lose at this critical juncture in the conflict. The fact that such attacks continue to successfully target senior officers even in Moscow itself demonstrates a level of operational capability that has clearly caught Russian security services off guard and raises questions about how many other senior military and intelligence officials might be vulnerable to similar operations. While that assassination grabbed headlines, the war itself continued with unrelenting intensity across multiple fronts, with Russian forces launching yet another devastating attack on Ukraine's strategically vital Black Sea port of Odessa late Monday evening. This strike represented the second such attack on the region in less than 24 hours, indicating a sustained Russian campaign aimed at degrading Ukraine's maritime infrastructure and its ability to export goods through the Black Sea. The attack damaged port facilities and struck a ship, adding to the toll of previous strikes that have systematically targeted the city's port operations over recent weeks. Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Alexei Kuleba characterized the assault as part of Russia's deliberate attempt to disrupt maritime logistics by launching systematic attacks on both port facilities and energy infrastructure, a dual approach designed to simultaneously cripple Ukraine's economic lifeline while making it more difficult for the port to operate, even if the physical facilities could be repaired. The attack also caused significant damage to energy infrastructure in the region, resulting in power outages affecting more than 120,000 customers throughout the Odessa region, leaving thousands of Ukrainian families without electricity as winter cold settles across the country. One person was reported injured in the latest attack, though the relatively low casualty figure should unobscure the broader strategic implications of Russia's sustained campaign against Odessa's port facilities. These attacks aim to strangle Ukraine's ability to export grain and other commodities through the Black Sea, undermining the country's economy while also potentially creating global food security concerns given Ukraine's role as a major agricultural exporter. The systematic nature of these strikes, coming day after day and sometimes multiple times within 24 hours, demonstrates Russian determination to eliminate Odessa as a functioning port regardless of the international condemnation such attacks generate or the impact on global grain supplies. In a particularly disturbing development that highlights the war's impact on civilian populations living near the front lines, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy confirmed media reports that residents of Harabovsk village had been forcibly taken by Russian troops in what appears to be a mass abduction of an entire border community. The village, which straddles the border with Russia and Ukraine's Sumy region and had a population of just 52 people, has now been effectively emptied as Russian forces seized all of its residents during their operations in the area. Among those taken were 13 Ukrainian servicemen who had apparently been in the village, though the fate of the remaining 39 civilians remains unclear and deeply concerning. This incident raises profound questions about what has happened to these people, where they have been taken, and what conditions they now face. International humanitarian law provides clear protections for civilians in conflict zones and prohibits the forced transfer or deportation of civilian populations, making this incident potentially a war crime that could eventually be prosecuted in international courts. The small size of Harabovsk, with its population of just over 50 people, makes the complete disappearance of the entire community particularly poignant, representing the kind of tragedy that often gets lost in the broader statistics of war but that devastates the families and communities affected. For Zelenskyy to personally confirm this incident in his public statements indicates that Ukrainian authorities view it as particularly serious and are working to determine the whereabouts and condition of those who were taken. The location of the village right on the border with Russia suggests this may have been an opportunistic action by Russian forces operating in the area, though whether this represents a broader pattern of such abductions or an isolated incident remains unclear. Ukraine demonstrated its own capacity to strike deep into Russian territory when its military successfully attacked a Tamenevtega's oil terminal in Russia's Krasnodar region during overnight operations, causing explosions and igniting fires at the facility. The Ukrainian General Staff characterized this oil terminal as part of Russia's energy infrastructure that directly supports the financing and logistics of Russian troops fighting in Ukraine, making it a legitimate military target under Ukraine's interpretation of the rules of armed conflict. By striking at Russia's energy infrastructure, Ukraine aims to degrade the economic foundations that support Moscow's war effort, reducing the revenue streams that fund military operations while also potentially disrupting the fuel supplies that Russian forces require to maintain their combat operations. The attack on the oil terminal was accompanied by Ukrainian drone strikes that damaged vessels at the Volna terminal in the same region, though regional authorities reported that all crew members on the ships had been safely evacuated before the drones struck. These attacks demonstrate Ukraine's growing capability to conduct long-range strikes against Russian territory using drone technology that has proven remarkably effective despite Russia's theoretically sophisticated air defense systems. The fact that Ukrainian forces can repeatedly strike targets hundreds of kilometers inside Russia reveals either gaps in Russian air defenses or the difficulty of defending against small, low-flying drones that can evade radar detection and interception systems designed primarily to counter larger aircraft and missiles. These strikes serve multiple purposes for Ukraine beyond just the immediate physical damage they cause, as they also demonstrate to the Russian population that the war is not some distant conflict happening entirely on Ukrainian soil, but rather something that can directly affect Russian territory and Russian infrastructure. On the diplomatic front, a complex and somewhat contradictory picture emerged of peace negotiations that appear to be progressing in some respects while remaining fundamentally stuck on core issues that have defined the conflict since its beginning. US President Donald Trump offered a characteristically brief assessment of ongoing talks aimed at ending the war, describing them as going okay while acknowledging that Moscow and Kyiv remain far apart on some key matters. Trump's laconic comment revealed little about the substance of negotiations, but suggested that some level of dialogue continues even if dramatic breakthroughs remain elusive. His administration has made clear its desire to facilitate an end to the conflict, though the practical challenges of bridging the enormous gap between Russian and Ukrainian positions have proven more difficult than the confident promises of quick resolution that characterized some of Trump's campaign rhetoric. President Zelenskyy, meanwhile, struck a somewhat more optimistic tone when discussing the negotiations that have been taking place in Miami, describing them as very close to a real result, in comments that suggested Ukrainian officials believe progress is being made. Speaking to a gathering of Ukrainian diplomats, Zelenskyy characterized the peace process as looking quite worthy, even as he acknowledged that not everything is ideal with this, but the plan is there. This careful phrasing suggests that while Ukrainian officials see some positive movement in negotiations, significant concerns remain about specific elements of whatever framework is being discussed. Zelenskyy's comments reflect the delicate position Ukraine finds itself in, needing to demonstrate willingness to engage in serious peace negotiations to maintain Western support while also ensuring that any eventual agreement protects Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity rather than simply ratifying Russian territorial conquests. In his nightly video address to the Ukrainian nation, Zelenskyy elaborated on what he sees as the key issue in current negotiations, framing it as a test of whether the United States can get a response from Russia, demonstrating real readiness on the part of that country to focus on something other than aggression. This formulation reveals Ukrainian skepticism about Russian intentions and suggests that Kyiv views current negotiations, at least partially, as an effort to determine whether Moscow genuinely seeks peace or is simply engaging in diplomatic theater while continuing to pursue military victory. Zelenskyy emphasized that continued pressure on the Kremlin remains vital to reduce Moscow's capacity to wage war, indicating that Ukraine does not view negotiations and military pressure as alternatives but rather as complementary approaches that must be pursued simultaneously. This position reflects a broader Ukrainian strategy that seeks to use both diplomatic engagement and continued resistance on the battlefield to create conditions that might eventually force Russia into accepting a genuine peace rather than simply a temporary pause that allows Moscow to regroup and resume offensive operations later. The Ukrainian president's emphasis on maintaining pressure suggests concern that premature diplomatic compromises or reductions in Western military aid could leave Ukraine vulnerable to renewed Russian aggression even if some form of ceasefire is achieved in the near term. The Kremlin, for its part, moved quickly to dampen any expectations that the Miami talks represented a major breakthrough, with spokesman Dmitry Peskov telling the Izvestia news outlet that the discussions should not be seen as producing dramatic results but rather as the beginning of what would likely be a meticulous expert-level process requiring sustained engagement over time. Peskov's comments appeared designed to manage both domestic Russian expectations and international perceptions, suggesting that while Moscow is willing to engage in negotiations, it does not feel under immediate pressure to make significant concessions or accept terms that it views as unfavorable to Russian interests. This measured Kremlin response contrasts somewhat with more optimistic characterizations from Ukrainian and American officials, revealing continued substantial gaps in how the different parties view the negotiations and what they hope to achieve through them. Peskov also took the opportunity to dispute a Reuters news agency report that cited U.S. intelligence assessments suggesting that Russian President Vladimir Putin wants to seize all of Ukraine and reclaim parts of Europe that once belonged to the former Soviet bloc. The Kremlin spokesman questioned the reliability of the sources behind this report and asserted that if the U.S. intelligence community genuinely held such views, then their conclusions were fundamentally wrong. This denial is somewhat predictable given that any Russian official would be unlikely to confirm such ambitious territorial goals in public statements, though. Western intelligence agencies and many analysts believe that Putin's ultimate objectives may indeed extend beyond just the portions of Ukraine currently under Russian occupation, in what might be interpreted as either a genuine diplomatic overture or simply tactical maneuvering. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov declared that Moscow stands ready to confirm in a legally binding agreement that it has no intention of attacking either the European Union or the NATO military alliance. This statement, reported by the state-run RIA news agency, appears designed to address European concerns about Russian intentions and to counter the narrative that Russia poses a broader threat to European security beyond its conflict with Ukraine. From Moscow's perspective, offering such assurances might help to drive wedges between different European countries about how to respond to the Ukraine conflict, with some nations potentially becoming more willing to consider accommodations with Russia if they believe their own security is not directly threatened. However, many European officials and analysts are likely to view such Russian assurances with considerable skepticism, given that Russia provided similar guarantees about respecting Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity in various agreements over the years, all of which were violated when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. The credibility of Russian diplomatic commitments has been severely damaged by these previous violations, making it difficult for European leaders to simply accept Moscow's word, even if such assurances are formalized in legal agreements. On the military aid front, the Czech Republic announced that its National Security Council will convene on January 7th to debate the future of a Czech-led initiative that has been organizing artillery ammunition supplies for Ukraine with financing from multiple Western donors. Prime Minister Andrej Babis confirmed that the scheme, which brings together contributions from countries including Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, will be reviewed to determine how it should proceed in the coming months. This Czech initiative has been important for Ukraine because it helps to aggregate ammunition procurement from various sources around the world, addressing critical shortages that have hampered Ukrainian military operations at various points throughout the conflict. The fact that the program's future is being debated rather than simply continued suggests either questions about funding, concerns about effectiveness, or possibly shifts in strategic thinking about how best to support Ukraine's military needs. Any reduction or termination of such ammunition supply programs would represent a serious blow to Ukrainian military capabilities, given the artillery-intensive nature of much of the fighting along the front lines, where both sides fire thousands of shells daily in efforts to suppress enemy positions and support ground operations. In a development highlighting the complex web of sanctions enforcement and maritime security issues surrounding the conflict, Swedish customs authorities released a Russian ship called the Adler after conducting an inspection over the weekend with marine tracking data confirming that the vessel was once again on the move. Swedish customs officials declined to provide details about what cargo the Adler had been carrying, maintaining the kind of operational security typical of such inspections. The Adler operates under European Union sanctions, while both the vessel itself and its owners, a company called M Leasing LLC, faced sanctions from the United States based on suspicions that they have been involved in weapons transport supporting Russia's war effort. The decision to release the ship after inspection rather than seizing it or preventing its departure suggests that Swedish authorities either did not find evidence of sanctions violations during their inspection or determined that the legal grounds for more aggressive action were insufficient. This incident illustrates the ongoing challenges that Western nations face in enforcing the complex web of sanctions imposed on Russia, particularly when it comes to maritime commerce, where vessels can change flags. Ownership structures can be obscured through shell companies, and cargo can be mislabeled or transshipped through third countries to disguise its origins or destination. The cat-and-mouse game between sanctions enforcement authorities and those seeking to evade such restrictions has become a crucial secondary theater in the broader conflict, with billions of dollars in trade and crucial war materials potentially at stake. As day 1398 of this conflict drew to a close, the fundamental dynamics remained largely unchanged, with intense fighting continuing along multiple fronts, diplomatic efforts proceeding but showing limited concrete progress, and both sides apparently convinced that their strategic objectives can still be achieved through some combination of military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering, setting the stage for what appears likely to be continued conflict well into the new year.